Hi, I'm Sarah and I'm the CEO of Dynamic Boards. And today I've got John Giesen with me. John's got a whole career of serving the housing sector. And I just checked and that's 53 years, which is amazing. Starting off in local government, that he then became the CEO of B3 Living. He's now officially retired, but he's had chair and non-exec roles with Suffolk Housing Society, Providence Row Housing Association, TPAS, and raised in Bristol. So John, just kicking us off, it's now 2021. What do you think the mix is like on housing association boards in the UK now?
I think it is mixed. I think there's, some organisations have recognised the value of diversity on their board and have maintained that throughout. I think if you go back to engaging with residents and lived experience on boards, some organisations actually swam against the tide when it was not popular to have it, when it was argued that you needed a more professional board. And there are lots of organisations that actually resisted that and maintained the value of having that lived experience on their boards. I think, however, that it's not universal, and I think some have ebbed and flowed where they may have become a champion of having diverse voices on their board, but that's ebbed away for a variety of reasons, and others that perhaps have never done it. And I think, if I'm being really controversial, I think a number of consultants who help recruit boards have actually advocated for professional boards, have told organisations that they shouldn't have that diversity on their board. And that you need a certain type of skills, but actually you need a skill that includes and values the lived experience. People actually understand what it's like to be in that position of being a resident or a tenant. And I think it's a shame that organisations have ebbed and flowed. So if I had to say where it's at the moment, I suppose I think it's at that point where organisations are recognising again the need to up the game, and are doing things about it. But I think the way that the culture of organisations works, it's important that it doesn't ebb and flow, and it doesn't fall or stand because of the particular chair or a particular chief exec or a particular government. And it needs to be something that's ingrained in it. And I don't think it has been over all of my time in housing. It has done that.
Yeah.
So it's no better than it was. It's no worse than it was. It's a shame that it's an indictment, I think, of us as a whole, that we haven't universally recognised the values of having that diversity. I think I'd also say it isn't just about being diverse in having a gay person, a black person, a woman, a disabled. It isn't just about that. It's also about the diversity of thought.
Yeah.
I think some organisations, for example, who've had residents on their boards think we don't need to think about it ourselves because we've got the resident and the resident can speak for every other resident, and they can't and they shouldn't. And it's a hard place to be if you're that resident trying to say to a professional body that actually you're not there just to speak for everyone else, because you can't. Your experience is your experience and other people's experience will be different. So I think it's important to get that and not just think, oh, we've ticked a box. Yeah. We've got an XYZ person on the board, so we've met that criteria.
Yeah, but we often try and think of it as, are we ticking boxes towards diversity or are we dancing towards dynamism? That's my recent phrase of, actually, this isn't something that you can write a little checklist. And if everyone does that, then they'll all have this brilliant board that's got a brilliant composition, because you could have a board that looks incredibly different and they're all accountants.
Yeah,
they've been trained to think the same way.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's suggesting all accountants are the same, because they're not.
Yeah, they're not.
But there you go. That's another story.
So John, we'll come to the reasons for hope a bit later, but Just wanted to ask about the struggles you've seen in housing governance, particularly around culture and values of organisations, and how the board stewards that.
Yeah, well, I think it's very topical at the moment because the white paper says that boards should be responsible for the culture and values of an organisation. And there's an awful lot going on at the moment with people talking about how do we do that as a board. And I think it's interesting because I don't think it's always been there. It's not something that's new. What's new is it's being more specifically referenced in the white paper. And I think it's right that boards should be responsible for the values. But I think, like many things, all things actually, not many, all things, it's important to start living the values at the very top. So, for example, if you think equality and diversity is important as an organisation, it's no good delegating that to someone else. As the leader of an organisation, and I'm including in that the chief exec, the senior leadership team, the chair and the board, if they're not demonstrating that that is an important thing for that organisation, it isn't important for that organisation. Because if they're not demonstrating it, other people will think, well, you know, it isn't important. What's important is the money, the this, the that, you know, the size of the development programme, whatever it happens to be. You need to actually show from the very top that it matters, and then people will take it seriously. So I think, you know, in terms of the culture, it's interesting how often the culture of an organisation and their values change with a change of leadership, and that can't be right. You know, there are times when it's important to change. You know, organisations in trouble may need a change at the top and a change of values in order to deal with that particular problem, and regulatory downgrades an example of that. But actually, if your values and your culture change every time you get a change of chair or a change of chief exec, there's something wrong, because the board isn't owning those values. So I think that's where it starts. It starts with the appointment and recruitment of your chair and your chief exec and your board members, and actually not enough attention is paid to that. And dare I say it, I think also that with some organisations, you know, they will use a consultant that actually takes over the process rather than helping with the process, and that's wrong. That's not, you know, it's your decision at the end of the day, and a consultant, any consultant, is only there to help you make that. But I think sometimes the help goes a bit beyond help and becomes you know, doing it for you. I think then, but having done that, I think then you cannot just rely on the voices in the room to be the way you actually monitor how the culture is going. So I think, you know, there's an onus on you as a board to find out how it is for staff, how it is for residents, how it is for other stakeholders. And I think, you know, obviously during 2020, 21, you could say that's become more difficult. I think actually there's easier ways of dealing with it as well, but we'll come to that in a minute. I think, you know, it's more difficult in that you're not going into the office. You're not having those casual conversations with members of staff when you arrive. You're not having conversations with other people, residents and other stakeholders when you meet them, because you're not meeting them in the same way. You know, you're coming onto a screen and the thing is starting. So you've got your coffee, and you know, it's all, those moments have gone. But I think there are ways of actually dealing with that. And I think,
the positive though, John, is that when you are speaking to them, it tends to be one-on-one. It tends to be no one else listening. So actually it means that when you do proactively make the effort now to get those insights, you're probably getting a very open conversation.
No, absolutely right. But you need to put yourself in that place to have the conversation. You know, the organisation needs to think it's important, and there are lots of ways of doing it. But you need to recognise that you need the structure of setting up a call like this to have that one-to-one conversation. and I agree with you, the conversations are better, which is why I said I think there are benefits to be had. I think listening to complaints is important as well. You know, why, you know, I was talking to someone the other day and they were saying about, you know, how many times do you need to complain before your voice is heard? And I think that's true. You know, there are times when the initial complaint may be dealt with, but it hasn't actually dealt with what's underneath it. And sometimes, you know, you need to keep that point going. I think it was Alistair Campbell who said, not that I agree with much of what Alistair Campbell says, but he did say something along the lines of, you know, you need to say things so often that in the end, people are telling you what your message is, and then it's made its mark. And I think that's true. I know of some organisations that have been really inventive before lockdown, but it's really served them well during lockdown to hear their residents' voices, for example. So I know of one association that has a filmed presentation at every meet. They're a big organisation across a big geographical area. So people travelling to their boardroom would not really be a practical way of engaging with a wider community, because, you know, people just can't afford the time or they've got other commitments. Whereas if they can film their comments and their views, and that will be shown to the board, warts and all, at the outset of a meeting, what they're doing is getting a much rounder understanding of what people think of their organisation. One chair said to me he was fed up with walking round estates where the grass had just been cut and the paint had just been repainted. You know, the smell of paint and the smell of cut grass wasn't what he wanted to see, because that wasn't what lived experience was. Inspectors used to pick up on that, you know, back in the day of the Audit Commission, you know, going out and about and seeing that you were trying to pull the wool over their eyes, you know, by taking them to places where the grass had just been cut and the paint had just been painted, you know.
It's like in the Olympics when the road's going up through London, that you could see going down those roads was improved. But it means if you go one street back, it wasn't in the end.
And we had that, you know, when I was at B3, we had that where people said, you've only done this because. We had the Olympic whitewater rafting part there. It wasn't true. I mean, we spent several £1 million on an estate because it was a promise that we'd made at the time of transfer, but it coincided with them doing the whitewater rafting, not the event, but the building of, and people were suspicious. But the fact was they could tell us that's what they thought. You know, we had the arrangements there where they felt comfortable telling us, and we were able to actually respond to what they were saying. All too often, people are not in that position. So, you know, you've not got that conversation, you've not got that voice. And it's really important that you've got those channels open.
Well, John, just to ask you about a case study, what was your experience like with Suffolk Housing? When you think of their culture and values and the mix they had on their board, what happened there?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was more to do with what had preceded us becoming the board, because they'd been downgraded. I think they were close to being closed, if I'm honest, but they weren't closed. They were sort of a G3 organisation, which is really bad. There were not many board members left from the original board. And we came into a place where, by reputation, Suffolk was seen as a good local association, and it was seen as sound, and it was seen as engaging with communities. It was seen as all sorts of things. But what we discovered was that that had been blown by the board not controlling what a previous chief exec had done. So certain decisions have been taken to buy some property that really wasn't, they paid over the odds for, and it wasn't very good, by building an office block that cost more than the value of the building, so that we had to write down the loss on it. And a realization that we were not really going to be in the position of putting it right, because there was, we weren't about to break covenants, but nor were we in a position to do anything about the problems. So over a period of time, and it was important that it wasn't a given at the outset, or it was for me at least. When I went there, I thought, like most others, I think this is an organisation we can save. It's worth saving. But over that couple of years, it became apparent that wasn't the case, and that there wasn't anything special. And worse, we couldn't see that it was possible to make anything special of it, so that services to residents, community partners were at best always going to be average or below average. So finding a way of actually dealing with that meant that merger was the obvious and really only way of determining how to make that change. But it's interesting that no one outside saw that because of it. They were still living in a period, say 5 years earlier, 10 years earlier, where, well, Suffolk's a really good organisation. I did, that's what I thought. Yep. And then you find out these things, but we found them out. And sometimes we found out almost without staff pointing. It was really challenging to get to that position, but it was really important that. And why did it happen? And I think it happened because they had a senior team that was very aggressively ambitious to do certain things, and a board not really controlling what was going on. And I think there'll be people listening to this that will go, "Oh, how do we fit into that?" But it's a good challenge. How do you know?
And what was the biggest failings of the non-execs in that scenario?
Not actually holding the exec to account, not seeing it for what it was, not challenging the decisions that we're making, and possibly, having a board that was too mono experience and culture. Obviously I don't know the board, but I don't think there was that diversity of voice on the board that would have led to someone going, hang on a minute. Now, I may be wrong on that because I don't know, because I wasn't there. But I suspect it was just a willingness to accept what was being said as the right thing.
And it is a challenge as a non-exec to ask unpopular questions. People always say, there's no stupid question. And actually, I think we've had that drilled into us that you should be allowed to ask any question. But the bigger challenge is asking a question that is unpopular at the point at which you ask it. And the chair to create a culture where that's welcomed.
No, absolutely right. There isn't a stupid question, because often it's the thing everyone else is thinking but is afraid to ask. And I think, it's a balance, like all things. I think, the unpopular question is valid, but there also comes a point where, if it's answered and the board as a whole collectively thinks that answer is the right answer, then there comes a point at which you either have to accept your view isn't accepted by everyone else, or you leave. You can't carry on being it's not like local government, where the opposition party opposes and that's what they're there to do. In a board situation, the discussion is intended to end up with a decision as a way forward. And when that decision is taken, you get behind the decision. If you don't agree with it, you argue about it, but there reaches a point where you need to accept it. And if you don't accept it, and it's so serious that you don't accept it, then I think resignation is the way forward.
My suggestion would always be, if anyone has those big challenges with what they've seen in an organisation, try and ask them at interview stage. If there's anything that you know that you're going to find very contentious or challenging when you're there, then actually don't accept a role unless. I agree, absolutely. But sometimes sometimes you don't know until you're actually in it, and it isn't quite what you thought at the interview stage. But I think you're right.
Why do certain people go for jobs into organisations that are well known for certain positives, and then try and change it to be a completely different organisation? Why do people do that? And I think, who knows is the honest answer why someone will. But equally, I think that's where the board role comes in, of owning the values and not letting it happen. You don't have to say, this chief exec, this chair has just been appointed, so we've got to agree with everything they say. You don't do that, in my view.
As a white male, when we hear a lot in the sector around encouraging more women to consider board roles and people from Black, Asian and minority ethnic backgrounds, what do you feel when you hear that a board you might have been interested in joining is looking for people from those backgrounds?
Well, it has happened to me, so it's not a hypothetical question, and I, in all honesty, felt it was the right thing for them to do, because I think if you roll back to me being chief exec of an organisation and my comments about championing equality and diversity, you need to demonstrate it at the top. I think part of that is not just holding someone's coat. So you can't be in the position where you say, oh, I'm really supportive of this, but I can't get my hands dirty. I can't do something. And people hide behind all sorts of excuses. I think, I can't have your experience. I'm not a woman. I can't experience that. But equally, it's not good enough for me just to say, I'll hold your coat for you to fight your battles. I've got to put my money where my mouth is and do something about it as well. And the same is true, I think, of accepting that to get that change that I think is necessary, sometimes it will be me or people like me that will be the loser, if losing is the right way of viewing it.
Unsuccessful in an application.
Yeah.
The reality, isn't it?
Yeah. It was quite interesting. I did have one experience where a consultant said to me I was unsuccessful because they were looking at a more diverse board and they'd got good people to go from. And then they said to me, but that isn't always the case. Sometimes we don't get all the good. If it's an organisation in trouble, we're less likely to get. So my point, I took it from that I would be more acceptable for an organisation that was failing than. But there you go. But no, I mean that's just an anecdote. I just think you cannot be honest to yourself and say, I really support this so long as it doesn't affect me. And you've got to therefore accept that there will be occasions where you are unsuccessful. I think it's easier for boards to make appointments on boards in that way. I think it's more challenging when you're recruiting staff because it is, but I still think you've got to find ways of making it work if you genuinely believe it's necessary. And it is necessary.
Reading a great book at the moment called Rebels by Matthew Said, and it talks about collective intelligence. So when you think about a board, you think about it as a group that needs to have collective intelligence. So actually between all of you, if you're going through a turnaround or a merger or something like that, you need to have someone around the board that has experience of that. But you need that collective intelligence that will be richest if it's an amazing mix of people. So I think it's a challenge to boards and to consultants if and when they use them to be able to reflect on the mix that they have sufficiently that they can really understand what they need to do when they're recruiting this person, what skills they need to
no, absolutely. And it's important that it's diverse thought as much as diverse people, because it is possible to recruit a board that it still has a group think, even if it is a very outwardly diverse group of people.
Yeah.
And avoiding that is important as well.
Finally, John, if anyone is thinking about applying for a board role and this is the first time they've considered it, what would be your message to them?
Go for it, basically. I think, yeah, I mean, be considerate of who you're applying for. You know, do your research. Is it an organisation you really want to be part of? Is it something where you think, you know, you align to their values? Don't apply for something that you feel is obviously different, because, you know, going in intent on changing it, going in intent on changing it isn't necessarily going to be possible in a short period of time. And you'd be far better, in my view, looking at organisations where you think, yeah, actually, I want to be here. I want to be with these people, and I can make a difference as well. And I think, you know, also be prepared to seek help and advice on it, because, you know, it can be a scary thing, and going to your first meeting, which may appear on the face, you know, everyone there may think it's very relaxed, but for you it will be anything but. So be prepared to talk and seek advice. And there's lots of organisations out there that will help you be ready for that board role.
And finding a mentor or good friends along the way is an important part of that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. And let's say there are places to do that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, John. Great to
You're
speak
welcome.
with you.
Yeah.
And thank you again for being a brilliant ambassador for Dynamic Boards.
You're welcome.
Definitely the best networked person in the housing sector.
I'm not that.
But it certainly feels it to us. Brilliant. Have a good rest of your day, John.
You take care. Bye then.